So, and let's just talk about it for a second. What do you guys think government is? I wouldn't do this all the time. I'll sometimes talk and sometimes I'll listen. But what do you guys think government is? What's a simple way of thinking about it?
An institution that regulates a society through laws and legislation.
Good. Did you hear what he said? An institution that regulates society through laws and legislation? It's very good. That's pretty solid. Anything else you can think about what is government? I got a follow-up question to it. That's a good answer. His answer is a very good answer. Is it necessary? Now listen, raise your hand and say why or why not, and nobody's wrong. We're just thinking, is it necessary?
Yeah, because it kind of brings in that balance that the people themselves will not be able to, come together and figure out.
He said it is, and it's because it brings about that balance. Anybody else?
In larger populations, it is since it's harder to control the population, but in smaller populations, it's less necessary since more people would be more independent.
He said larger populations more necessary maybe than smaller populations. I understand that. We have, how many forms of government do we have in front of us like all the time? At least 3? What are they?
Judicial, executive, legislative.
Okay, those are branches. You're not wrong. No, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. Those are branches. You're good. Do you want to follow up?
With what?
So what I'm talking about is the actual organization, but you're not wrong. That's within the government.
You're talking about like the different types of government?
When I say that, I mean levels, layers of actual government. What's the national government called?
Federal, state,
You see what I'm-
Yeah,
city, and
local.
municipal.
State and local, right. So did you get that? National, federal, local. Local, in our case, like where we're at right now, that'd be city and county. City and county, and then state, then national, right? We'll get to all that too, because it's weird having 3 or 4 different governments at the same time, essentially over us. That also kind of stinks when it comes to taxes, because we might get smacked 3 times, which none of us care for, right? So think about that though. And who's in charge if there's 3 layers like that? Who's in charge? In our country, 2 or 3 times, they couldn't decide who was in charge, and it led to a war. Or in the case of 1957, you'll get there, it led to Dwight Eisenhower having to send federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas to escort 9 African Americans into school because the state of Arkansas was not abiding by a federal law, right? So this is problematic. So I liked your answer, but you guys heard government's an institution, right? Essentially, it's an institution that regulates laws through legislation. Okay, next question. Here's a follow-up to the first one still. Is law necessary? Let's think about, we're just kind of throwing it out there. I'd write that down. Do you think law is necessary? Why or why not? Yeah. Okay, why? Okay, good. He said it is because it holds people accountable for their actions.
To prevent anarchy.
And to prevent anarchy. Anarchy is like total chaos, right? Eruption. Pandemonium. I like that. One of our founders, John Adams, said the number one thing that concerned him the most about democracy, though, listen to this. Just think of it. John Adams said the one thing that concerned him the most about democracy, and we're going to define that in a minute, was chaos. Like, in other words, if everybody's free, it could get out of control, couldn't it? If we're all loose. And so he said he was for democracy, but he just said, gotta be careful. So he's thinking out loud, how can we do that? So one of the things we're going to talk about in the next couple chapters in particular is kind of this evolution to a free country. Because it's one thing to say freedom, it's another thing to be free. Everybody wants freedom. But even freedom, think about this, even freedom has to have some parameters. You've heard the phrase that you can't yell fire in a theater, right? We just had a devastating fire in the Bronx. You guys heard that story? 200 people were inside this apartment building. 17, 18 had died. 9 children. Fire's no joke. And fire in a big building is definitely no joke. Especially if you're talking about New York City skyscrapers. I'm on the 10th floor. We all learned that from the Twin Towers in 9/11, right? You're on the 90th floor. are you ever gonna get down, type thing. So even freedom though has rules. You have to have rules, like when you speak, I was talking about the contract earlier, like, you know what I mean? That's an important thing. We have a contracting class. I'll get to all this later on. I know I will. But there's a big challenge with all that. Like here's one challenge, for example, in just equality. I'm your teacher. I'm never above you. In my American brain, I'm never more important than you are. In the room I am because I'm in charge. Because somebody has to. Again, going back to government, the idea you got to have a government. Somebody has to lead. Somebody has to do something. It's like running a business or coaching a team. Somebody has to take the job. So while they're doing that, we respect them. So this is definitely a process. Like, how will you do freedom? You want freedom, but how will you do freedom? So one of my specialties is 19th century U.S., Civil War, the American West, etc. I always say there's a difference between freedom and liberty. You're going to get to this when we do the American Revolution. There's a difference between freedom and liberty. Here's what I think, this is my opinion. Freedom is truly walking out of the jail cell. Like, it's the bare bones. I'm loose. Liberty is what I do with my freedom. So freedom is literally just getting out of the jail cell. Liberty is what I do with my freedom. It's my ability to do things. So, for example, when African Americans were not allowed to participate, they might have had their bare bones freedom, but they really didn't get liberty. Not until they got to vote, not until they could go where they wanted to go, be where they wanted to be, do what they wanted to do all the time without question. They truly didn't have their liberty. They were getting it in pieces. By the way, you could say the same thing about the poor. You could say the same thing about, don't think of it just racially. You could say the same thing about the poor. You could say the same thing about women. I would argue with you that women did not have their liberty till at least post-1920. On and on and on. So the idea of acting it out. So just keep that in mind. Then lastly, and I already kind of stepped into this a little bit. Lastly, who votes? Who votes? Yeah, after the age of 18. But that's a big question. Our founders, who did some right and some wrong, had the right idea, but our founders thought for a minute that maybe only people who owned stuff could vote. And you might say, that's mean. Well, they didn't know remember that no other country in the world allowed full voting. So they were stepping into the unknown. They thought maybe if you didn't own anything, you wouldn't care. You wouldn't pay attention. You wouldn't get literate enough to know what to do. And by the way, literacy, how important is literacy in education? If you don't know how to read and write yourself, especially in that era, you don't know how to read and write yourself, you're voting based on what somebody else told you. That's not good. Again, going back to that idea of independence. So they're going to argue who votes, and then they're going to say, okay, we know we want this, which we'll define this better here in just a minute. We know we want this, but it can't be chaos. And we know this, that different people had different opinions of what equality is. Even Adolf Hitler said that he was doing something that was based on equality. Wrong, right? Totally wrong. But he said it. So you got to do more than just say, hey, everybody's equal, let's move forward. You got to make sure equal really means equal. It's back to what I said a minute ago about if you're not giving everybody full advantage, then that's not good. Okay? All right. Now you guys threw up some definitions. Oops. But let's just look at these for a minute. I'll read them if you can't see them well. Look how close we are to what you said a minute ago. Government, the means by which a society organizes itself and allocates authority in order to accomplish collective goals. Some people hate the word collective, by the way, and I get that. How do you protect the person and the society? Our national motto is e pluribus unum, out of many, one. So we've always been balancing the many and the one and the many. We always have. So how do you do that? That's not easy. One of my professors used to say this. He said, government's awesome when it's the referee. I thought that's pretty cool. He said, what you don't want them to do is become the player. Which you might say today, sometimes they're a player. Or maybe you say, no, that's good, I'm glad, we'll talk about all that. And then secondly, a definition of politics. The process by which we decide where things go, how resources are allocated. Just kind of introducing us to some bare bones terms. So government and politics. In this first chapter, we're kind of talking through the challenges of history a little bit regarding all of this, and then the second chapter we'll start talking about how America did it, what examples we used, why history is important, and even this discussion. Now these are in our readings too, which I'll before I forget, I'll go back to that and show you that online source. Now I'm going to talk about these for a minute. So let's just talk about these. So when America is formed, one of the things that we adopt is a system known as capitalism. So some historians and some economists will tell us that capitalism is the freedom form of our government. It's the economic freedom form of our government, right? So this says an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit, rather than by the state. State meaning the country, in this case, right? So why do we think this through with me? Don't go to the second, third terms for a bit here. Why would we want a system of private ownership? What's the pros and cons of that? What's the advantages of that? A system of private ownership. Yeah.
You're in control of your own finances, your own well-being, your own well-doing in society.
Right. You're in
You don't have
control.
regulation.
Do you like that?
Yes.
You like that? That means you get to buy what Starbucks drink you want. Right? Not what the government tells you. It means you get to buy. Now I make a joke. I shouldn't make a joke, right? Because in some countries you're standing in line to get your bread. Still, I'm not a fan, right? I like to look around. I'm a shopper. I want to think for myself, dream for myself. You got a blessing of every morning getting up and saying, what do I want to be? What do I want to do? Look around and see who's who. As one of my veterans who used to come to my class, he used to say that he dropped out of high school. He went to the military, ended up in Vietnam, but he said his sergeant came up to him one day and he said, there's two kinds of people in the world. There's winners and losers. You better decide which one you want to be. And he said that changed his life. He said for all the school he screwed up, for all the life he screwed up, he said he was standing in the jungles of Vietnam and a guy said, there are winners and losers, which one do you want to be? He said, I want to be a winner. I will be a winner. He said, well, you better get your act together. He said, it changed his life, like one moment, right? Private ownership. Take control. Now again, what's the flip of that? State ownership, which means the government owns it in some form. In some form. That would mean so what would that look like in our world?
Communism.
Well, communism, another step further, but yeah, you're right.
Like a park?
Okay, that's an interesting point. Now, park, they would argue that if the state owned a park for and it was for ours to use, but you're not 100% wrong. You're tipping. We have state-owned park, federal-owned parks. But where I would disagree or not disagree, but say different is that's not a profit element.
Oh,
So if you think about it in a capitalistic sense, it's profit. So that would be the government owning things like Walmart. Or name some other businesses we like, Starbucks, or, yeah, you name anything, right? It'd be the government owning those businesses. The problem with that is if they own the businesses, they regulate the prices and they kind of have control of you too, because you got to get your stuff somewhere. I mean, your needs and your wants, right? So that can be problematic. That can be kind of problematic. About 5 or 10 years ago, we had kind of an economic downturn, and the government had a moment where the car dealerships, the car manufacturers, I should say, Ford, GMC, these kind of people, they were in terrible shape, right? The government helped. The government helped a lot. Like took them and lifted them up. Some people said great because they saved a lot of jobs. Some people said, careful, because if the government ends up owning them, you know, like if you put too much money in, you're gonna end up owning them. You own them, that's a game changer. So that's what this would be. So keep that in mind. We're a capitalist country, but that's not a one-size-fits-all. So keep that in mind. Second term that's up here is democracy, which we've already mentioned. Our founders are wrestling with some of these terms, or will be. A form of government which political power rests in the hands of the people. So that's us. That definitely is us. Now, listen, we are not just a democracy. We're going to get to all that. We're an element of this. So here, let me give you this real quick. A democracy, a true democracy, just that, this will be scary in a way, would be voting without anything else. So if we want to do this thing or that thing or the other thing, like right in here, I don't know, we have almost 40. We vote. We do it. Next day, we vote again. We do it. Next day, we vote again. We do it. That's what democracy is. The problems with democracy without chains, without connections, without parameters, the problem with democracy is not only chaos, but after a while, I realize the 10 people in the room I don't agree with. And guess what? I start to push around on them a little bit. I start to dislike them quite a bit. And suddenly, that's what we call a direct democracy, which can be quite dangerous. So our founders are going to say, like elements of democracy, don't know if we can completely apply it just as democracy. So we'll get to that. And then lastly, what we call a republic. Note these terms. So a republic is a form of government which supreme power is held by the people and their representatives. We look a lot more like a republic than a democracy, which we'll get to it. But this is a republic. We weren't the first in history. We were the first to do it the way we did it, but we weren't the first in history, which you'll learn about that next class period. Now I want to end on this slide, and then I'll go back and show you that source, and we'll write Wednesday. Just again, don't write any of this down. Don't even think you need to write this down. Just listen. Just be thoughtful for a minute. So if capitalism is one system, and it's an economic system of freedom, and you mentioned communism. We'll talk more about communism later on, but just economically speaking, this would be what it looks like to be private ownership. This is what it looks like to be government ownership or some form of public ownership. Okay? So I'm going to read a couple of them. Capitalism, an economic system where means of production are owned by private individuals or entities. Socialism, an economic system based on public ownership of the means of production. The problem with this side, which there's a lot of socialist nations in the world today. Bernie Sanders was socialist. He said he was socialist. I'm not saying call this evil. I'm not saying that at all. But the challenges are incentive and motivation. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not telling you that we're all 100% capitalism. You're going to learn in a minute or later we're not. So here's something you could write in your notes as an end of thought. We're a mixed market economy. We're a mixed, I'll say it again Wednesday, so don't sweat it, but we're a mixed market economy, meaning our financial system, kind of like our government in general, has learned to be flexible. So somebody said earlier, you said, if you're a big country, you're going to need government more. A lot of people. You also better learn how to be flexible because a lot of moving parts, millions and millions and millions of people. Okay, tell me if you have questions. We just kind of got ourselves going a little bit. We got thoughts going a little bit. Yeah.
What do you mean by like flexible? Give me an example of that.
Yeah. So, well, even though I may or may not agree with what they did, when they went in to do the auto buyout thing, they're trying to be flexible. They're saying if 100,000 people, 200,000 people lose their job in Michigan, it's going to take the economy into a nosedive. So your flexible would be allocation of money in ways you maybe wouldn't normally see, things like that. I can tell you more. Now, having said that, I'm going to be honest with you. It could be dangerous because what happens is you might set a precedent. Like, if I'm a business and my business is about to go down and you just bought out the last business or helped them out, I might say, hey, why don't you help my business out, right? And then that becomes problematic. So we'll get to some of that. Here, let's go to this source real quick, or at least write this down maybe, or pay attention. So openstacks.org, if for those of you guys, if you haven't used it. I'll find it here in a minute, I have that first. So openstacks.org, and here, I'll call this up bigger in just a second. That is our book. So when you go to OpenStax, OPENSTAX.org, when you go to OpenStax.org, you can just click on subjects. I think it goes subjects, social studies, government. But you'll see this third edition American government. We're going to live in this guy. So this is our first chapter. Yeah.
Where is it again?
Sorry. OpenStax.org. Oh, and it's STAX.org. Okay.
Is it, the one that's free?
Yeah.
Okay.
Third edition. Anybody else have any other questions or thoughts? We can hang for a couple minutes here.